The bullet grazed her shoulder as she ran through the muddy streets of Columbia, California, clutching the precious letter that would either save her life or condemn her forever. Winifred Kane stumbled against a rain-soaked barrel, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the angry voices behind her grew louder. It was November 1876, and the mining town was caught in the grip of autumn storms that turned the streets into rivers of mud and made escape nearly impossible. Her fingers tightened on the envelope she had fought so hard to retrieve from her former employer's desk, evidence that could clear her name of the theft she had never committed. There she is, the thief. A woman's shrill voice cut through the downpour, and Winifred recognized Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the banker's wife who had set this nightmare in motion 3 months ago. Winifred's dark hair hung in wet tangles around her face as she ducked into an alley between the general store and the blacksmith shop. At 23 years old, she had thought she had finally found stability as a seamstress in Columbia after her husband's death, 2 years prior. Thomas had been a good man, taken by fever before their first anniversary, leaving her alone in a world that had little mercy for widows. She had worked hard, kept her head down, and tried to build something resembling a future. Then the accusations had started. Missing jewelry from Mrs. Thornton's home where Winifred had been altering dresses. Missing money from the shop where she worked. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. The evidence had been flimsy, circumstantial, but in a town like Columbia where reputation meant everything, circumstantial was enough. "You are wasting your time believing you can start over, Mrs. Thornton had told her coldly when Winifred had begged for understanding. "A woman with your kind of shadow following her deserves exactly what she gets. There are no second chances for people like you." The words had stung worse than any physical blow. Winifred had always believed in redemption, in the possibility of new beginnings. Her mother had taught her that everyone deserved a second chance, that mistakes did not define a person forever. But Columbia had taught her differently. The town had mocked her for clinging to such naive notions, for believing that truth and hard work would eventually prevail. She pressed herself against the wall as footsteps splashed past the alley entrance. The letter inside her coat was growing damp despite her efforts to shield it. She had discovered it by accident when delivering finished alterations to the Thornton house that morning. Mr. Thornton had been away, and his study door had been left carelessly open. Winifred had glimpsed her own name on a paper atop the desk, and against every instinct of self-preservation, had looked closer. What she found had made her blood run cold. Letters between Mrs. Thornton and her brother, plotting to frame Winifred for theft to cover the brother's gambling debts. Instructions on where to hide the stolen items so they would eventually be discovered in Winifred's small rented room. Plans to use the scandal to distract from their own financial crimes. She had taken the most damning letter and fled, knowing she had perhaps hours before its absence was noticed. Now those hours were up, and half the town seemed to be hunting her through the storm. Winifred knew she could not stay in Columbia. Even with evidence, the Thorntons had too much influence, too many friends in positions of power. She needed to get away, somewhere remote where she could think and plan her next move. The mountains loomed to the east, dark and forbidding in the downpour. Stories circulated about men who lived up there, trappers and hunters who wanted nothing to do with civilized society. Dangerous men, some said. Others called them free. She had no choice. The mountains would have to be her refuge. Making her way to the livery stable, Winifred slipped inside while the stable hand was distracted by the commotion in the street. Her mare, Clementine, the one possession of value she still owned, stood in her stall looking placid despite the chaos. Winifred had been keeping the horse stabled here because her small room had no space for an animal. Now she silently thanked God she had not been forced to sell the creature yet. With shaking hands, she saddled Clementine, her fingers fumbling with buckles and straps. She had little with her besides the clothes on her back and the damning letter, but there was no time to retrieve her few belongings from her room. Those would be confiscated anyway once the mob decided she was truly guilty. Leading Clementine out the back entrance, Winifred mounted and urged the mare toward the edge of town. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world into a gray blur. She could barely see 20 feet ahead as Clementine picked her way up the muddy trail that led into the Sierra Nevada foothills. Behind her, Columbia disappeared into the mist like a bad dream. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as afternoon faded into evening. Winifred had no real destination in mind, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and her accusers. The temperature was dropping, and her wet clothes clung to her skin like ice. She began to shiver uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue and tasted blood. Clementine struggled gamely up the rocky path, but the mare was tired and frightened by the storm. When lightning cracked across the sky, the horse shied violently to the left. Winifred, exhausted and numb with cold, lost her grip on the reins and tumbled from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her shoulder and hip. For a moment she could only lie there in the mud, gasping for breath, watching Clementine's retreating form disappear into the darkness. Then the reality of her situation crashed over her like a physical weight. She was alone in the mountains with night falling, injured, soaked to the bone, and with no shelter in sight. Winifred forced herself to her feet, biting back a cry as her injured shoulder protested. She had to find cover or she would freeze to death before morning. Stumbling forward, she searched desperately for anything that might provide protection from the elements. A cave, an overhang, even a dense cluster of trees would be better than nothing. The world tilted and spun around her. She realized dimly that she might be going into shock. Her feet no longer seemed to belong to her, and the darkness at the edges of her vision was spreading. She took 3 more steps before her legs gave out entirely. "This is how I die," she thought with strange clarity. Alone in the mountains, just like everyone said I deserved. Then strong hands were lifting her, and a deep voice was rumbling something she could not quite make out. She tried to focus on the face above her, but saw only a dark beard and intense eyes before consciousness slipped away entirely. Winifred woke to warmth and the crackling of fire. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in her childhood home, sick with fever while her mother tended her. Then memory returned in a rush and she jerked upright, immediately regretting the movement as pain lanced through her shoulder. "Easy now." That same deep voice from before, closer now. "You took a nasty fall. Nothing broken as far as I can tell, but you gave yourself a good bruising." She turned her head and found herself looking at the most striking man she had ever seen. He sat on a rough wooden chair near the fireplace of what appeared to be a small but well-built cabin. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a startling gray-green, steady and intelligent, watching her with an expression somewhere between concern and wariness. He was massive, built like the mountains themselves with broad shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt. His forearms, visible where his sleeves were rolled back, showed corded muscle and old scars. This was a man who worked with his hands, who lived a life of physical hardship and had been shaped by it into something formidable. "Where am I?" Winifred managed, her voice hoarse. "My cabin. About 8 miles east of Columbia, up in the high country." He stood, and she realized he was even taller than she had thought, well over 6 feet. He moved to a small table and poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "Name is Yates Finch. I was checking my trap lines when I found you collapsed on the trail." He brought her the cup, and she took it with trembling hands, noticing for the first time that she was wearing a rough wool nightshirt that was definitely not her own. Her cheeks flushed hot. "Your clothes were soaked through," Yates said matter-of-factly, reading her expression. "Would have killed you to leave them on. They are drying by the fire now. I did not look more than necessary to get you changed and check for injuries. You have my word on that." There was something in his tone, a quiet dignity that made her believe him. She sipped the water, letting it soothe her raw throat. "Thank you for helping me. You did not have to. Could not exactly leave you to freeze." He returned to his chair, giving her space. "Though I will admit to curiosity about what drove a woman out into the mountains during a storm like last night. Running from something." Winifred hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious, to protect herself with lies and deflection. But this man had saved her life when he could have easily walked past. She found herself wanting to tell him the truth. "Running from accusations I did not earn," she said quietly. "From people who decided my guilt before any trial. From a town that mocked me for believing I could prove my innocence." Yates studied her for a long moment. "Did you do what they say you did?" "No." She met his gaze squarely. "I have evidence proving it was all a frame, but the people responsible have power and influence. I took what I could and ran because staying meant being arrested for crimes I did not commit." "What kind of crimes?" "Theft, jewelry and money from the household where I worked as a seamstress." She set the cup down carefully on the small table beside the bed. "I am a widow, Mr. Finch. My husband died 2 years ago, and I have been working to support myself ever since. I thought I had found a place in Colombia, but I was wrong." "Yates," he said, "no need for formality up here." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "So you have evidence but nowhere to use it, and now you are stuck in the mountains with a stranger. That about sum it up." Despite everything, Winifred felt a small smile tug at her lips. "That is depressingly accurate, yes. Well, you are welcome to stay here until you figure out your next move. I do not have much, but what I have is yours to share. Weather should clear in a day or two, and then we can talk about what comes next." She stared at him in surprise. "You would do that? Let a stranger stay in your home? You know nothing about me." "I know you were half frozen and hurt, and I know you looked me in the eye when you said you were innocent." Yates shrugged his massive shoulders. "I have spent 5 years up here getting away from people who lie and cheat and take what they want regardless of who it hurts. I learned to read folks pretty well in that time. You are scared and desperate, but you are not a liar. That is enough for me." Winifred felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. After months of suspicion and hostility, his simple acceptance felt like water in a desert. "Everyone else called me foolish for believing in second chances, for thinking people could change or that truth mattered. Maybe everyone else is wrong." Yates stood and moved to the fireplace, stirring something in a pot that hung over the flames. The smell of stew filled the cabin, making Winifred's stomach growl despite her emotional turmoil. "I came up here because I needed a second chance myself. Made some mistakes down in the valley, trusted the wrong people, and paid for it hard. Figured the mountains would not judge me the way civilization did." "What happened?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "I am sorry, that was presumptuous. No more than me asking about your situation." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. "I worked as a foreman at a lumber mill down near Sonora. Owner's son took a dislike to me, started making trouble. When equipment went missing and money came up short in the company accounts, he made sure all signs pointed my way. I was bigger and stronger than most, and I had a temper back then. Easy to paint me as the villain. Winifred accepted the bowl, her hand steadier now. But you were innocent, as the day is long, did not matter. His father believed him, and the law believed them both. I left before they could arrest me, came up into these mountains with nothing but what I could carry on my back. He settled back into his chair with his own bowl of stew. That was 5 years ago. Built this place with my own hands, learned to trap and hunt, made a life that does not depend on anyone else. It is lonely sometimes, but it is honest. They ate in silence for a while, the storm still raging outside but seeming distant and unimportant within the solid walls of the cabin. Winifred studied her surroundings more carefully now. The cabin was small but well crafted, with tight joints and a solid roof that did not leak despite the downpour. Furs covered the floor and the single bed where she lay. Tools hung neatly on the walls alongside drying herbs and strings of what looked like jerked venison. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work and his space. "Why did you not try to clear your name?" she asked finally. "With the lumber mill, I mean." Yates was quiet for a long time, and she thought perhaps she had overstepped. Then he sighed. "Same reason you ran instead of fighting. When the deck is stacked against you and the people with power have already decided your fate, fighting just means suffering longer before the inevitable. At least up here I control my own destiny. But do you not miss it? Civilization, I mean. Other people, conversation, all the things that come with living in town. Some days more than others." He met her eyes across the dim cabin. "But mostly no. People down there, they are so quick to judge, so ready to believe the worst. They mock anyone who does not fit their narrow view of how things should be. Up here, the only judgment comes from nature, and that is honest at least. A storm does not care about your reputation. A mountain lion does not ask if you made mistakes in the past. Everything is simple." Winifred set her empty bowl aside. The stew had been simple but filling, warming her from the inside. "Is that what you want? Simplicity forever?" I thought it was. Yates's expression was thoughtful as he looked at her. "Now I am not so sure." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. She looked away, suddenly very aware that she was alone in a remote cabin with a man she had just met, wearing only his nightshirt. But strangely, she did not feel afraid. Yates Finch radiated a kind of quiet strength that felt protective rather than threatening. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Winifred slept deeply, her exhausted body demanding rest to heal from her ordeal. When she woke the second time, pale sunlight was filtering through the cabin's single window. Her clothes lay neatly folded on the chair where Yates had been sitting, clean and dry. Yates himself was outside. She could hear the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. She dressed quickly, grateful to be back in her own things even though they were worn and travel-stained. The letter was still tucked safely in her coat pocket, slightly worse for the damp but legible. When she opened the cabin door, she found a world transformed. The storm had passed, leaving everything washed clean and gleaming in the morning light. The mountains rose all around, their peaks dusted with fresh snow. The air was crisp and cold and tasted of pine. Yates looked up from his woodpile, the axe held easily in one hand. With the sun behind him and his hair loose around his shoulders, he looked like something from a storybook, a mythical figure conjured from the wilderness itself. Sweat gleamed on his face despite the cold, and she could see the play of muscle beneath his shirt as he moved, feeling better. He asked, setting the axe aside. "Much, thank you again for everything." She stepped out onto the small porch, hugging herself against the chill. "I should probably start thinking about what comes next, probably." He gathered an armload of split wood, but there is no rush. Winter is coming on fast up here. Another few weeks and these trails will be impassable until spring. The implication hung in the air between them. If she stayed much longer, she would be trapped here for months, alone with him. "I cannot impose on your hospitality for an entire winter," Winifred said, though part of her whispered that the prospect was not entirely unwelcome. "It would not be imposing. Truth is, I could use the company." Yates carried the wood to the cabin, stacking it neatly beside the door. "And you could use a safe place to recover and plan. Seems like it might work out for both of us. But what about food, supplies? Surely you do not have enough stored for 2 people through a mountain winter." "I have been trapping and hunting these mountains for 5 years. I know where the game runs and how to preserve meat to last. Got a root cellar stocked with vegetables from my garden, smoked fish from the creek, enough flour and beans to see us through. We would not starve." He met her eyes. "Question is not whether we would survive. Question is whether you trust me enough to stay." Winifred considered this. What did she know about Yates Finch, really? That he had rescued her in a storm, that he claimed to be innocent of past crimes just as she was, that he lived alone and seemed kind in the rough way of mountain men. It should not have been enough to make her consider spending months isolated with him. But when she looked at him, she did not see danger. She saw a man who had been as wronged as she had been, who had chosen solitude over the mockery and judgment of others. She saw strength tempered with gentleness, isolation that had not hardened into cruelty. And she saw something else, something she was not quite ready to name. "I do not have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "At least nowhere I would be safe. The Thorntons will be looking for me, and their reach extends to most of the settlements in this region. Then stay." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Help me with chores around here and we will call it even. I could use someone to help process the furs and manage the food stores, and it would be good to have another voice to talk to besides my own." She smiled despite herself. "I imagine talking to yourself gets old after 5 years. You have no idea," so it was decided. Winifred Kane would spend the winter in the high country with a mountain man she barely knew, hiding from false accusations and trying to figure out how to reclaim her life. As plans went, it was probably the most improbable thing she had ever agreed to. But then again, her mother had always told her that second chances rarely came in expected packages. The first few days were awkward as they learned to navigate sharing the small space. Yates insisted she keep the bed while he made himself a pallet near the fireplace. They established routines around each other, finding a rhythm that allowed them both privacy despite the close quarters. Winifred discovered that Yates was a man of few words but genuine ones. When he spoke, it was with purpose and honesty. He showed her how things worked around the cabin, from the complex system of snares and traps he maintained to the way he smoked meat in a small shed behind the main building. He taught her to recognize different animal tracks in the snow that began to fall more frequently as November gave way to December. In turn, she took over the cooking and mending, skills she had honed during her brief marriage and subsequent years working as a seamstress. She found ways to improve the cabin's comfort, fashioning curtains from spare fabric Yates had traded for in better days, reorganizing the storage to be more efficient, adding small touches that made the rough space feel more like a home. They talked in the evenings, sitting by the fire after supper. Winifred learned that Yates had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 6 brothers. His father had been a blacksmith who believed in hard work and harder discipline. Yates had left home at 17 seeking adventure, working his way west through various manual labor jobs before ending up at the lumber mill where his troubles began. "My brothers all settled down, got married, had families," he told her one night as snow whispered against the windows. I was always the restless one, the one who could not seem to fit into the life everyone expected. Guess I am still that way. I do not think wanting more than what you are given makes you restless, Winifred said, working her needle through a tear in one of his shirts. I think it makes you brave. He looked at her with those startling gray-green eyes. Is that what you were doing in Colombia? Being brave? I was trying to be. My husband, Thomas, he was a good man, but we married young and practical. His family knew my family, it made sense. That is what everyone said. I cared for him, and I think he cared for me, but it was not the grand passion you read about in books. She paused in her sewing, staring into the fire. When he died, I was sad, but I was also something else. Free, maybe. It felt wrong to think that way about becoming a widow, but I could not help it. For the first time, I could make my own choices. And you chose to work as a seamstress. I chose to support myself honestly, to build something that was mine. The seamstress work was just how I did it. She resumed her stitching. Everyone said I should remarry quickly, find another husband to take care of me, but I wanted to prove I could take care of myself. Foolish, probably. Not foolish. Brave, like you said. Yates leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Most women would have taken the easy path. The easy path came with giving up parts of myself I had only just discovered. I was not ready to do that. She tied off the thread and bit it clean. Though I suppose my stubbornness is what landed me here. Here is not so bad, is it? Their eyes met and something electric passed between them. Winifred felt her breath catch. No, she said softly. Here is not bad at all. The moment stretched, charged with possibility. Then Yates cleared his throat and stood, mumbling something about checking the traps before bed. Winifred watched him pull on his heavy coat and step out into the night, and she wondered if he felt the same pull she did, or if she was imagining things born of proximity and loneliness. As winter deepened, the bond between them strengthened. They worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs and movements. Yates began to seek out her opinion on things, asking her thoughts on where to set new trap lines or how to improve the cabin's insulation. Winifred found herself watching for his reactions when she tried new recipes or rearranged something in their shared space. One morning in mid-December, Winifred woke to find Yates had already been out and returned, snow dusting his shoulders and something bundled in his arms. Found her caught in one of the lower snares, he said, revealing a small dog, some kind of mixed breed with wiry fur and intelligent eyes. Could not leave her out there to freeze. Figured we could use a third party around here anyway. The dog, whom Winifred promptly named Scout, brought new energy to the cabin. She was playful and affectionate, dividing her loyalty equally between her two rescuers. But more than that, she gave them something to care for together, creating a feeling of family that had been missing. Watching Yates gentle the initially frightened animal with infinite patience, Winifred felt something shift in her chest. This was a man who could have become hard and bitter from his experiences, but instead, he remained capable of kindness. He was strong enough to survive alone in the wilderness, yet he chose to share what he had with a stranger and a stray dog. Christmas came quietly. Winifred fashioned decorations from pine boughs and berries, filling the cabin with the scent of evergreen. Yates surprised her by producing a small bag of precious coffee beans he had been saving for a special occasion. They sat up late that night, sipping the rich brew and telling stories from their childhoods. I used to think second chances were something you earned, Winifred said, cradling her cup between her palms. That if you worked hard enough and were good enough, the universe would reward you with a fresh start. But Columbia taught me that is not how it works. Sometimes the world decides you do not deserve another chance, regardless of the truth. "So what do you think now?" Yates asked. "I think second chances are not something you earn or are given. I think they are something you take." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You took yours when you came to these mountains. I took mine when I ran. We both refused to accept what others said we deserved. And here we are." He gestured around the cabin with a slight smile. "Two people the world gave up on, hiding out in the high country. I prefer to think of it as two people who refused to give up on themselves." Yates set down his cup and moved to sit beside her on the bench she occupied. The movement brought him close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "Winifred," he said, his voice low and rough. "These past weeks with you, they have been the best I have had in 5 years, maybe longer than that. I know it is probably too soon, and I know you have been through hell, but I need you to know that having you here has changed things for me. I am not sure I want to go back to being alone when spring comes." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Yates, you do not have to say anything," he interrupted. "I just needed to tell you, needed you to know that this has been more than just helping out a stranger. You have become important to me." Winifred set her own cup aside with trembling hands. "You have become important to me too, more than I expected, more than I probably should have let happen." "Why should not you have let it happen?" "Because I am still technically a fugitive. Because come spring, I will have to figure out how to clear my name. Because my life is a disaster and you deserve better than someone being hunted for crimes she did not commit." Yates reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. "I am someone being hunted for crimes I did not commit. Seems like we are well matched." Then he kissed her, and the world fell away. His lips were warm and gentle despite his rough exterior, asking rather than demanding. Winifred leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest against his broad chest. She could feel his heart beating as hard as her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I am glad you finally did." They sat that way for a long moment, simply existing in each other's space. Then Yates pulled back slightly, his expression serious. "I do not want this to be just a winter romance, something that ends when the snow melts and you go back to your real life." "What do you want it to be?" "I want it to be real. I want us to be real." His thumb stroked across her cheekbone. "I know it is fast and I know it is crazy, but I am falling in love with you, Winifred Kane. Have been since you looked me in the eye that first day and told me the truth even though you had no reason to trust me." Tears spilled down Winifred's cheeks, but they were not sad tears. "I am falling in love with you too. I fought it because it seemed impossible, seemed like the worst possible timing. But my heart did not care about timing or logic. Hearts rarely do." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she responded with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. When his arms came around her, lifting her easily into his lap, she went willingly, trusting his strength and his honor. They did not go further that night, both wanting to savor the newness of what they had found. But they fell asleep tangled together on his pallet by the fire, Scout curled at their feet, and Winifred thought she had never felt more at peace. January brought brutal cold and snow that piled in drifts higher than the cabin's windows. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the world below by impassable trails and weather that could kill in minutes. But inside their small sanctuary, Winifred and Yates built a life together. They talked about the future, about what would happen when spring came. Yates suggested they could head further north, start over in Oregon or Washington Territory, where no one knew either of them. Winifred was tempted, but part of her rebelled at the idea of running forever. "I have evidence of my innocence," she reminded him. That letter proves the Thorntons framed me. Should not I at least try to use it? And if it does not work, if their influence is too strong, then at least I tried. At least I did not let them win without a fight." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You said I was brave. Let me live up to that." Yates sighed but nodded. "We do it together then. When the pass is clear, we go down to Columbia together and we face this as a united front. If things go badly, we run. But we run together." "Together," she agreed, sealing it with a kiss. In February, as the worst of the winter began to ease, they made plans in earnest. Yates had a friend, another trapper named Marcus, who lived about 15 miles north. When the weather permitted travel, they could go to Marcus first, get his perspective on how to approach the situation in Columbia. Marcus had connections in various towns and might know if the Thorntons were still actively searching for Winifred. They also talked about marriage. Yates proposed properly one evening, getting down on one knee beside the fire with a ring he had carved from antler bone. "I do not have much to offer you," he said, holding out the simple band. "No fancy house in town, no respectable position. Just me and this cabin and a life that will probably always be a little rough around the edges. But I love you with everything I am, and I will spend every day trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" Winifred's answer was yes before he even finished asking. She pulled him up and kissed him fiercely, pouring all her love and joy into the connection. The ring fit perfectly on her finger, and she wore it with more pride than she had ever felt for her first wedding band. They married themselves that night, speaking vows before the fire with Scout as their only witness. It was not legal or official, but it felt more real than any ceremony in a church. They promised to love and honor each other, to face whatever came as partners, to believe in second chances and new beginnings. When Yates carried her to the bed they now shared openly, Winifred went with joy and anticipation. He was gentle and passionate, treating her like something precious while also not holding back his desire. They learned each other's bodies slowly, taking time to discover what brought pleasure, building toward a crescendo that left them both breathless and tangled together in the furs. "I love you," Yates murmured against her hair as they lay in the aftermath. "My wife." "I love you too," she whispered back. "My husband." March brought the first real thaw. The snow began to retreat from the lower elevations, and the trails slowly became passable again. Yates and Winifred made the journey to Marcus's cabin, arriving to find the older trapper delighted to meet his friend's new bride. Marcus was a weathered man in his 50s with a long gray beard and a cackling laugh. He welcomed them warmly and insisted they stay for supper. Over venison stew and cornbread, they explained the situation. "The Thorntons are still making noise about finding you," Marcus confirmed, dashing Winifred's hopes that they might have given up. "But there has been another development. Seems Mr. Thornton's brother-in-law got himself arrested down in Sonora for gambling fraud. Made a lot of enemies, and some of them are talking. Word is there might be an investigation into the whole family's dealings." Winifred and Yates exchanged glances. "An investigation could work in our favor," Yates said, "especially if we have evidence tying the family to criminal activity." "It is risky," Marcus warned. "You would be putting yourself right in their crosshairs. But if this investigation is legitimate, the timing might be right." They spent 2 days with Marcus, weighing their options. In the end, they decided to approach the law in Columbia, but carefully. They would contact the sheriff through an intermediary first, gauge whether he was in the Thorntons' pocket or if he might actually listen to evidence. Marcus offered to be that intermediary. He had no outstanding warrants and occasionally came down from the mountains to trade furs. No one would think twice about seeing him in Columbia. The plan set, Winifred and Yates returned to their cabin to wait. It was agonizing, not knowing what was happening, but they had to trust Marcus to handle things. In the meantime, they prepared for multiple outcomes. If the sheriff proved trustworthy, they would come down from the mountain and make their case. If not, they needed to be ready to pack up and leave the region entirely. 2 weeks later, Marcus returned with unexpected news. The sheriff, it turned out, had been suspicious of the Thorntons for months, but lacked evidence to act. The letter Winifred possessed was exactly what he needed. Moreover, the investigation in Sonora had uncovered financial records that corroborated the story in the letter. The Thorntons were already under scrutiny, and the sheriff wanted Winifred to come forward as a witness. "He guarantees your safety," Marcus said. "Says he has been hoping someone would be brave enough to stand against that family. He is bringing in a federal marshal to handle things, make sure it is all done proper and legal." Winifred felt hope and terror warring in her chest. This could actually work. "Or it could be a trap," Yates said, his protective instincts flaring. "How do we know the sheriff is telling the truth?" "You do not," Marcus admitted. "But I met the man myself, looked him in the eye. He struck me as honest and desperate for a way to take down the Thorntons before they corrupt the whole town." After much discussion, they decided to trust the sheriff, but take precautions. Yates would go into Columbia first, armed and ready to extract Winifred if things went wrong. She would follow with Marcus, meeting the sheriff in a public place with witnesses around. The letter would be handed over only when they were certain of the sheriff's intentions. In early April, with wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows, they descended from the mountains. Winifred's heart pounded as Columbia came into view, the town that had rejected and pursued her. But Yates's solid presence beside her gave her courage. The meeting took place in the church, neutral ground with the minister present as an additional witness. Sheriff Daniels was a middle-aged man with a lined face and tired eyes. He listened to Winifred's story without interruption, then studied the letter she handed him with growing satisfaction. "This is damning," he said finally. "Combined with what we have uncovered in Sonora, this should be enough to arrest Mrs. Thornton and her brother. Mr. Thornton might escape charges if he can prove he was not involved, but his reputation is finished either way." "What about Winifred?" Yates asked, his hand protectively on her shoulder. "She was accused of theft. Those charges need to be cleared." "They will be. I will make a public statement exonerating Mrs. Kane of all charges and explaining that she was the victim of a frame. It will be in the newspaper, official record, everything." The sheriff looked at Winifred with something like admiration. "I have to say, madam, it took guts to come forward like this. Most folks would have just kept running." "I am tired of running," Winifred said simply, "and I had help." She glanced up at Yates, who squeezed her shoulder gently. The arrests happened the next day. Winifred and Yates watched from the hotel window as Mrs. Adelaide Thornton was led out of her house in handcuffs, her face a mask of fury. Her brother followed in a separate wagon, already bruised from what looked like a fight with the deputies. Word spread fast through Columbia. The newspaper ran a front-page story about the frame job, about how a poor widow had been targeted to cover up the Thorntons' crimes. Public opinion shifted overnight. People who had mocked Winifred for her claims of innocence now fell over themselves to apologize, but Winifred found she did not care much about their apologies. The validation was nice, but her life had moved beyond needing Columbia's approval. Several of the town's women approached her that afternoon as she and Yates prepared to leave. They were the same women who had whispered and gossiped behind her back, who had mocked her for believing in second chances. "We are so sorry," one of them said, wringing her hands. "We should have known you were innocent. We should have believed you." "Why should you have believed me?" Winifred asked, genuinely curious. "You did not know me well enough to judge one way or the other. You just chose to believe the people with power and status." The woman flushed. "That is not fair. The evidence looked convincing." "The evidence was manufactured. If you had been willing to give me a second chance to hear my side, you might have realized that." Winifred felt Yates's presence solid behind her, but it does not matter now. "I found my second chance anyway, no thanks to you." She turned to leave, but another woman spoke up. "Are you staying in Colombia now that your name is cleared?" "No." Winifred looked back at them with a small smile. "I have a home in the mountains now. A real home, with someone who loves me and believes in me. That is worth more than any reputation in this town." As they rode out of Columbia that evening, Winifred on a new mare Yates had purchased with the reward money the sheriff had paid them for their testimony, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The town that had rejected her was now a speck behind them, and she had no desire to look back. "No regrets?" Yates asked, guiding his horse alongside hers. "About leaving? Not even one?" She smiled at him, this man who had given her so much more than shelter from a storm. "You are my second chance, Yates Finch. My chance at real happiness, real love, real partnership. Everything else is just details." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "You are mine too. The woman who walked into my life and reminded me that isolation was not the same as living. I love you. I love you too." They rode back into the mountains as the sun set, painting the peaks gold and orange. Scout ran ahead of them, barking joyfully at birds and squirrels. When they reached the cabin, it felt like coming home in a way Columbia never had. That summer, they expanded the cabin, adding a second room that would eventually serve as a nursery. Winifred was not pregnant yet, but they talked about children, about building a family in this wild, beautiful place. Yates taught her to hunt and fish, skills she had never imagined learning. She taught him to appreciate small domestic comforts, the way fresh curtains could brighten a room or how wildflowers in a jar could lift the spirits. Marcus became a regular visitor, stopping by once a month or so to share news from the wider world. Through him, they learned that Mrs. Thornton had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and theft. Her brother got 10 years. Mr. Thornton had indeed escaped criminal charges, but had been financially ruined by the scandal. He left California entirely, headed back east to stay with relatives. Winifred felt satisfaction at the news, but not the vindictive pleasure she had once imagined. Her life was too full of good things now to waste energy on hatred. In September, she realized she had missed her monthly courses. By October, there was no doubt. She was pregnant. Yates's joy was boundless when she told him, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are having a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "A real family." "We were already a real family," Winifred corrected, but she was smiling. "This just makes us bigger." The pregnancy was not easy. Morning sickness plagued her through the fall, and the winter was harder this time, with her changing body making everyday tasks more difficult. But Yates was attentive and patient, taking over most of the heavy work and fussing over her in ways that were both endearing and occasionally annoying. Marcus brought a midwife from a settlement to the north when Winifred's time drew near. The woman, a capable widow named Pearl, stayed with them for 3 weeks, teaching Yates what to do if the baby came early or if there were complications. In late May, with the mountains in full bloom and the world alive with new growth, Winifred went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through a full night and into the next day. Yates held her hand through all of it, whispering encouragement and wiping her brow with cool water. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Winifred wept with exhaustion and joy. Yates cradled the tiny, red-faced infant with hands that could break branches but were impossibly gentle with this fragile new life. "He is perfect," Yates breathed, all written across his face. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Winifred's first husband, because she wanted to honor the man who had been kind to her even if their marriage had not been a grand romance. Yates had no objection, understanding that carrying the name was a blessing, not a burden. Thomas Finch proved to be a healthy, hungry baby with his father's sturdy build and his mother's dark eyes. He fit into their mountain life as if he had always been meant to be there. Scout appointed herself his guardian, lying beside his cradle and watching over him with devoted attention. As Winifred healed from the birth and learned to navigate motherhood, she often thought about the journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her 2 years ago that she would be living in a mountain cabin with a husband she loved desperately and a newborn son, she would have thought them mad. But life had a way of surprising you. Second chances came in the most unexpected forms. One evening in late summer, with Thomas nursing contentedly and Yates carving a wooden toy by the firelight, Winifred felt overwhelmed by gratitude. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked. "When I told you about Columbia mocking me for believing in second chances?" Yates looked up from his carving. "I said maybe everyone else was wrong. They were wrong about so many things." She looked down at their son. "They said I did not deserve another chance, that my life was ruined, that I should accept my fate. But you did not accept it, you fought." Yates set aside his work and came to sit beside her, wrapping one arm around her shoulders. "And you won. We won," she corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you. You gave me the second chance they said I did not deserve. You believed in me when no one else would. You did the same for me." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I was just existing up here, not really living. You reminded me what living feels like." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son nurse and listening to the mountain wind whisper through the pines outside. Scout dozed by the fire, occasionally twitching in her sleep as she chased dream rabbits. "You ever think about going back?" Winifred asked. "To civilization, I mean. Living in a town again, having neighbors and community." Yates considered this. "Sometimes. Especially when winter is hard or when Thomas gets sick, and I worry about being so far from a doctor. But then I think about what we would have to give up. The peace here, the freedom to live on our own terms, the way we can just be ourselves without worrying about what anyone thinks." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "I do not need civilization if I have you and Thomas. You two are my community." "We could still have visitors," Winifred suggested. "Marcus comes regularly. Maybe we could invite others, people we trust, build our own kind of community up here." "I like that idea." Yates smiled. "A community of people who understand second chances, who do not judge based on the past but on who you are now." Over the next few years, that vision became reality. Marcus brought other mountain folk to visit, people who lived on the edges of society for various reasons. Some were like Yates and Winifred, fleeing false accusations or unfair treatment. Others simply preferred the solitude and honesty of wilderness life. They established a loose network of cabins and trappers spread throughout the high country. They helped each other through difficult times, gathered occasionally for celebrations, and protected each other from those who might seek to do them harm. Winifred became known as a healer of sorts, using knowledge passed down from her mother and learned from the midwife Pearl. People came from miles around when illness struck, trusting her skills with herbs and medicines. Yates's reputation as an honest man and skilled hunter made him a natural leader within their small community. They had 3 more children over the years. 2 daughters named Rose and Grace, and another son they called Samuel. The cabin was expanded multiple times to accommodate the growing family, until it was less a simple mountain shelter and more a proper homestead. Thomas grew into a strong, curious boy who loved exploring the mountains with his father and learning to track animals. Rose had her mother's quick mind and gentle hands, already showing talent with healing herbs at age 5. Grace was fearless, climbing trees and wrestling with Scout until both were exhausted. Samuel was still a baby, but he had his father's gray-green eyes and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. On their 10th anniversary, Yates and Winifred returned to the spot where he had found her collapsed in the storm. They stood together looking down at the trail, now familiar and well-traveled, and marveled at how much had changed. "If you had told me that night what the next decade would bring, I never would have believed you," Winifred said, leaning into Yates's solid warmth. "What would you have thought? That it was too good to be true. That happiness like this was not meant for people like us." She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek. "But I would have been wrong. People like us," Yates said thoughtfully, "are exactly the ones who appreciate happiness when we find it, because we know what it is like to go without." They kissed there on the mountainside, a long, slow kiss that held 10 years of love and partnership and shared struggle. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. "Thank you," Winifred said softly, "for giving me a second chance when no one else would. For loving me when I was at my lowest, for building this life with me." "Thank you for trusting me," Yates replied, "for staying that first winter, for believing I could be more than just a man hiding in the mountains." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, their children's laughter echoing through the trees as they played in the clearing. Scout, now gray around the muzzle but still spry, barked in greeting. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Winifred took out the letter that had started everything. She had kept it all these years, a reminder of where she had come from. But looking at it now, she realized she no longer needed it. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, seeing her with the yellowed paper, that it is time to let go of the past completely. She carried the letter to the fireplace. "This represented my fight to clear my name to prove I deserved a second chance, but I do not need proof anymore. I know my worth. I know our worth." She dropped the letter into the flames and watched it curl and blacken. Yates came to stand beside her, sliding his arm around her waist. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing his question from years before. "Not even one?" She turned in his embrace, rising on her toes to kiss him. "I found exactly what I needed when I fled into these mountains. I found you, I found myself, and I found home." Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnessing their happiness with silent approval. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns as old as time, marking the passage of another perfect day in a life built on second chances and stubborn hope. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of mountain life. Thomas, at 18, had grown into a young man who stood eye to eye with his father, though he lacked Yates's breadth of shoulder. He was preparing to make his first solo trading trip down to one of the settlements, a rite of passage that filled Winifred with both pride and terror. "He will be fine," Yates assured her the night before Thomas's departure. "We raised him right. He knows how to handle himself, and he has a good head on his shoulders." "I know." Winifred watched their eldest son checking his supplies for the 3rd time. "It is just hard to watch them grow up and leave, even temporarily. That is what we are supposed to do, though, raise them strong enough to make their own way." Yates pulled her close. "Besides, he is coming back. He loves these mountains as much as we do." Thomas did return, 3 weeks later, full of stories about the settlement and the people he had met. But more than that, he came back with a deeper appreciation for the life his parents had built. "Everyone down there is so concerned with what others think," he told them over supper. "Always judging, always competing. I could not wait to get back home where people just live." Winifred and Yates exchanged knowing looks. Their son had learned the same lesson they had, that authentic living mattered more than social approval. Rose, at 16, had become an accomplished healer, working alongside her mother to tend to the scattered community's medical needs. She had a special touch with difficult births and had already helped deliver 3 babies successfully. Pearl, now elderly and unable to travel much, had passed her knowledge to Rose with the confidence that it would be well used. Grace, at 14, was as wild and free as the mountains themselves. She could outshoot most of the men in their community and tracked game with uncanny skill. She had no interest in traditional domestic pursuits, preferring to spend her days exploring with her father or helping Marcus check his trap lines. Samuel, at 10, was the scholar of the family. He devoured every book that made its way up the mountain and taught himself to draw with charcoal on scraped hide, creating remarkably detailed sketches of plants and animals. Winifred saw her own younger self in him, hungry for knowledge and understanding. Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep one winter when Samuel was 12. It was a blow to the entire mountain community, but especially to Yates, who had considered the older trapper his closest friend. They buried him on a ridge overlooking the valley he had loved, marking the grave with a cairn of stones that would stand for generations. "He lived exactly how he wanted," Yates said at the small funeral, his voice rough with emotion. "Free and on his own terms, that is all any of us can hope for." In Marcus's memory, they named their next gathering place the Marcus Ridge Trading Post, a small structure they built communally where people could leave supplies for each other and post messages. It became the heart of their scattered community, proof that civilization could exist without the judgment and cruelty they had all fled. As Winifred approached 40, she thought often about the woman she had been at 23, terrified and alone on a stormy mountain trail. That woman had been so afraid, so certain her life was ruined beyond repair. If she could speak to her younger self, she would say that the worst moment was actually the beginning of the best thing. She would say that second chances were real, but they required courage to seize. That love could be found in the most unexpected places with the most unexpected people. That family was not just about blood, but about choosing to show up for each other every single day. On her 45th birthday, her children surprised her by organizing a gathering of the entire mountain community at their homestead. More than 30 people came, bringing food and music and laughter. They celebrated not just Winifred's birthday, but the community she and Yates had helped create, a place where people who did not fit elsewhere could find belonging. As the sun set and the fiddles played, Winifred danced with Yates under the stars, moving to music as wild and free as their lives had become. His hair was more gray than dark now, and new lines marked both their faces, but his arms were still strong and his eyes still held that same steady devotion. "Happy?" he asked, spinning her gently, deliriously. She laughed, breathless from the dance. "Who knew that losing everything could lead to gaining so much more?" "You did," Yates said seriously. "You believed in second chances when no one else did. You fought for yours and helped others find theirs. Everything we have here exists because you refused to give up." "We refused to give up," she corrected. "This is ours together." The party continued late into the night, stories and songs echoing off the mountain peaks. Children raced through the trees with torches, creating rivers of light in the darkness. Adults shared memories and made plans for the coming year, When everyone had finally departed or bedded down in various corners of the expanded homestead, Winifred and Yates sat on their porch watching the stars. Scout had passed several years ago, but they had other dogs now, descendants of that first scrappy rescue who had brought such joy to their lives. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found me that night?" Winifred asked quietly. "Every once in a while." Yates laced his fingers through hers. "I think I would have kept living up here alone, gradually becoming more isolated and set in my ways. Eventually, I would have been one of those strange old hermits that people tell stories about. And I probably would have frozen to death on that trail." Winifred squeezed his hand. "Or been caught and sent to prison for crimes I did not commit. Either way, I would not have had this life, this family, this happiness." "Funny how one decision can change everything," Yates mused. "I almost did not go check the traps that day because of the storm. Told myself it could wait, but something pushed me out there anyway. Fate," Winifred suggested. "Maybe, or maybe just dumb luck," he smiled at her. "Either way, I am grateful." They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other when both were at their lowest, who had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their former lives. The mountains around them stood as silent witnesses, ancient and eternal, holding their happiness in stone and sky. As the years continued to flow like water over rocks, smoothing and shaping but never destroying, their love remained the foundation of everything. Their children grew and married, some staying in the mountains and others venturing into the wider world with their parents' blessings, and the knowledge that home would always be there. Thomas married a woman from one of the settlements, a schoolteacher named Elizabeth, who fell in love with mountain life, and with him in equal measure. They built a cabin 3 miles from the main homestead and gave Winifred and Yates 4 grandchildren. Rose never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to healing. She traveled between the various mountain communities, always welcome, always needed. She told her mother once that she had found her purpose, and that was worth more than any conventional life. Grace married a gruff trapper who was one of the few men who could match her wildness. They ranged far into the high country, appearing at the homestead once or twice a year with furs to trade and tales of adventure. They had 2 children who were as untamed as their parents. Samuel eventually left for San Francisco, his hunger for knowledge drawing him to the city's libraries and universities. But he returned every summer, bringing books and newspapers and stories from the outside world. He never married, claiming his true love was learning, but he maintained close ties with his mountain family. When Winifred turned 60, Yates organized a celebration even larger than her 45th birthday gathering. People came from 100 miles in every direction, mountain folk and settlers alike, all touched in some way by the community that had grown around the Finch homestead. At the celebration, person after person stood to share how Yates and Winifred had helped them find second chances. A man who had been falsely accused of murder and had hidden in the mountains until the real killer was caught. A woman who had fled an abusive marriage and had found safety and sisterhood among the mountain women. A family who had lost everything in a fire and had been given shelter and supplies to start over. Winifred wept openly as she heard these stories, understanding fully for the first time the ripples their lives had created. They had not just saved themselves by fleeing to the mountains. They had created a refuge for others who needed what they had found. "You gave us hope," one young woman said, holding a baby in her arms. "When everyone said we did not deserve another chance, you showed us we did. You built a place where second chances are not just believed in but celebrated." That night, lying in bed with Yates's arms around her, Winifred thought about the journey from that terrified widow running through the rain to this woman surrounded by family and community. The path had not been easy, and there had been moments of doubt and fear, but every step had been worth it. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, his voice rough with sleep. "How far we have come, how much we have built." She turned in his embrace to face him. "How grateful I am that you gave me a second chance at happiness when no one else would." "You gave me the same," he said, cupping her face gently. "And every day since has been a gift." They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other as they had been for nearly 40 years, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and had chosen each other every day since. As Winifred drifted into dreams, she thought she could hear her mother's voice, warm with approval. "Everyone deserves a second chance, my darling, everyone." And she had been right, so beautifully, perfectly right. The mountains kept their vigil, unchanging and eternal, while the people within their embrace lived and loved and built futures from the ashes of their pasts. And in a sturdy cabin built with calloused hands and stubborn hope, two people who had been given up on by the world slept peacefully, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had claimed against all odds. Their story was not one of easy triumph or simple resolution. It was messier than that, more complex, more real. But it was theirs, built on a foundation of trust and love and the radical belief that people deserved more than their worst moments. And in the end, that belief had been enough to transform two broken lives into something whole and beautiful, proving that second chances were not just possible but powerful beyond measure. The story of Winifred Kane and Yates Finch became legend in the mountains, passed down through generations as proof that redemption was real and love could heal even the deepest wounds. Children grew up hearing about the widow who ran into the storm and the mountain man who gave her shelter, about how they built a community based on acceptance and hope. Their homestead stood for more than a century, eventually becoming a landmark and then a historical site. But long before that, while they still lived and breathed and loved, it was simply home. A place where second chances flourished like wildflowers after rain, where judgment held no power, and where two people who had every reason to give up chose instead to believe in each other and in the possibility of happiness. And they lived that happiness fully, completely without reservation, for all their remaining days. Together, as they had promised that snowy Christmas night so many years ago, facing everything as partners, building a legacy that proved love and faith and second chances could triumph over any adversity. Their ending was not dramatic or sudden. As they aged into their 70s and 80s, they simply continued living, watching their grandchildren have children of their own, tending their garden, sitting on their porch in the evenings talking about everything and nothing. When Yates passed peacefully at 85, surrounded by family with Winifred holding his hand, his last words were simple. "Best decision I ever made was helping that woman in the storm. I love you." Winifred followed him 6 months later, unable to exist long without her other half. Her children found her in the rocking chair on the porch, a peaceful smile on her face, looking out at the mountains that had been her refuge and her home. They buried them together on a ridge near where Marcus rested, overlooking the valley and the life they had built. The marker was simple, just their names and the dates, but it needed nothing more. Their legacy was not in stone but in the community that continued to thrive, in the children and grandchildren who carried their values forward, in every person who believed in second chances, because they had proven such things were possible. And on clear nights, when the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains whispered their ancient songs, those who knew the story swore they could feel it still, that stubborn hope, that fierce love, that absolute certainty that everyone deserved a chance at happiness, and that sometimes the worst moments led to the very best lives. The end came peacefully for their story, as all good stories should, with everything resolved and nothing left hanging. Two people who had been mocked for believing in redemption had proven the mockers wrong in the most spectacular way possible, by living fully and loving completely and building something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. And that was exactly the happily ever after they deserved.